So yes, this is our series, Los Angeles Stories, Interpreting the City of Angels. And what we're doing here, if this is your first time, is we're trying to interpret this uninterpretable city, which only makes you want to interpret it more. So we love doing this. We could do this for years. We probably will do this for years. How many Los Angeleses are there? So many. So what we're doing in this series is we're taking authors who lived here and wrote about Los Angeles and using those authors as lights to interpret the city. And we've already seen how Ramona, a protest novel designed to improve the treatment of Southern California Indians, ends up being the creation myth of Los Angeles by accident and by greed, as boosters latched onto it and the railroad to make it a place to come and visit, a novel, which again I think is just so important for Los Angeles. People came here to see a fictional place, and we are a fictional place in so many ways. And then we did Aldous Huxley last week. Oh my goodness, that guy was just incredible, and he knew our founder, Manly Hall. In fact, there's a photo of him in the bookstore. Incredible body of work, just brilliant. And then tonight we move to James M. Cain. Sex, Money, and Snobbery. James M. Cain's Depression-era Los Angeles. Thank you for coming out. And let's see what he had to say. How he viewed and even created this city, as you'll see. So, born July 1st, 1892, died October 27th, 1977. Courtney, that's not your apartment, is it?
That's actually, I walk past that every day on my hike. That's my dream house.
Oh, okay. Well, that was James M. Cain's. That's right. There's something in the air and water up there, apparently. So in 1914, he was sitting on a park bench in Washington, D.C., and he heard his own voice telling him that he was going to be a writer. His own voice. I kind of like that. Not some other voice. His own. He was 22. Awesome. For 3 years, he wrote with no success while teaching math and English at Washington College. Not uncommon for writers, as many of you may know. Finally, he took a job in 1917 at the Baltimore American, and the following year at the Baltimore Sun, and then he began teaching journalism courses at, I think, Washington College. And eventually became editor and writer of the New York World. And for a short time, edited the New Yorker magazine, but it's only about 9 months before they kicked him out and he fled to California. He also his major influence was H.L. Mencken. Does anybody know that name? Yeah. Wonderful satirist in the early 20th century. If you want to read some brilliant and biting, cutting journalism, read H.L. Mencken, well, on anything, but especially on the Scopes trial in Dayton, Tennessee. This was where a biology professor was arrested for teaching evolution. And Clarence Darrow got involved, and William Jennings Bryan, and it was tailor-made for H.L. Mencken. And so that's who mentored James M. Cain. This will become very clear as we move through some of his works. He was drawn to the vernacular he heard in the streets, and he told his biographer that his fascination with this language was no doubt due to, quote, the impeccable grammar of the household in which I grew up. So you don't see this very often. Here's a man who was raised in a household where English and correct English and usage and pronunciation and erudition was taught, and he didn't want any of it. And so, as you'll see, his writing is very much, well, let me just quote him. He writes, "I tried to write as people talk. That was one of the first arguments I ever had with my father. My father was all hell for people talking as they should talk. I, the incipient novelist, even as a boy, was fascinated by the way people do talk. The first man I ever sat at the feet of who enchanted me, not only by what he told me, but how he talked, was Ike Newton, who put in the brick wall over at Washington College. The way he'd use language. I'd go home and talk about it to my mother's utter horror, and to my father's horror too. My childhood was nothing but one long lesson. Not preventative, but preventive. Not sort of a, but a sort of. Not those kind, but that kind, or those kinds. Jesus Christ, on and on and on, he says. Very unusual to see that. Usually writers stay within that upbringing, that he rejected it, resisted it. And then he came to Hollywood in 1931. This is one of the best lines I've ever heard. He came to Hollywood, and like we'll see next week with Fitzgerald and others, he went to write. And apparently he ambled onto a set, and a director saw him and said that James M. Cain looks like an ex-sheriff of San Bernardino. That is one of the best lines, because the genius is X, right? He's not the sheriff of San Bernardino. He was once the sheriff. Absolute genius. Right, 1931. And again, this works well with his predilection for the vernacular. He says this, "I moved to California and heard the Western roughneck, and it was the voices of the down on their luck Californians that would eventually, of course, fill his novels." All right, so lots of works. This is not all of them, but you will recognize some of them. First one was The Postman Always Rings Twice, and we'll talk about that one. Serenade, Three of a Kind, Double Indemnity, we'll talk about that one. And then others here. Notice The Cocktail Waitress, 2012, after he died. So someone took I forget his name, someone took the manuscript, tried to put it together. That usually doesn't work too well. So you may not have heard of The Cocktail Waitress, but there's the very pulpy cover. So let's get into The Postman Always Rings Twice. So as I say these, you may not even know they were novels because they got their fame as film, really. Well, mostly. This one was really a big seller. Postman Always Rings Twice. And it's actually the last one that was made into a film. So his first debut novel is the last to become a film. The original title was Barbecue. You'll see why. And he had heard the story of a couple of philanderers who offed the woman's husband, and he said this, "That gels the idea I've had for just such a story. A couple of jerks who discover that a murder, though dreadful enough morally, can be a love story too. But then wake up and really? Okay. But then wake up to discover that once they've pulled this murder off, no two people can share this terrible secret and live on the same earth, right? And you'll not be surprised that this is the birth of noir, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the literary critic, Postman Always Rings Twice. You may know the film. You may know the 1981 Jack Nicholson, Jessica Lange film. But you all also may know the first film with, yes, and Lana, thank you. Luc Sante called The Postman Always Rings Twice a prose poem hallucinated from a pot boiler. I love that. A prose poem hallucinated from a pot boiler. And Clifford Feidemann, who says that this novel has all the Cain trademarks, his slightly brutal contempt for his characters, right? His interest in violent extremes of conduct, his mastery of cinema plot tricks, his non-tragic handling of tragedy, right? Albert Camus said that his most famous novel, The Stranger, was inspired by The Postman Always Rings Twice. Yeah. By the way, I don't have this in my notes, but he hated that title, Cain did. He wanted to call it Barbecue, and then he said The Postman Always Rings Twice, and it doesn't make any sense. He said Postman Always Rings Twice is too long, and it doesn't make any sense. In fact, apparently, I don't know if anybody knows, I don't remember this, but when the postman came, back in this period at least, he would ring once if he had dropped something off. He would ring twice if there was something to be delivered. So just let that rest there and think about the story. Something is being delivered. The opening line is maybe one of the more famous ones. They threw me off the hay truck about noon. That's good, right? Opening line. We're going to talk about this. Frank, one of the characters, is a drifter. That's who got thrown off the hay truck. Nick is the owner of the Twin Oaks Tavern in Glendale, California. Who sets a novel in Glendale? And Cora is Nick's wife and Frank's lover. So we're going to talk about Cain's view of women. But here's another line, and this is not uncommon in Cain's work, is this kind of gaze on the female character, and it's not a pleasant gaze. Here, for example, except for the shape, she wasn't any raving beauty, but she had a sulky look to her, and her lips stuck out in a way that made me want to mash them for her. Noir, right? A writer who has contempt for his character, right? Interesting. So, I don't know how to summarize The Postman Always Rings Twice. I don't know how to summarize any of these novels because it's noir, and so there are all these twists and turns and double backs and double crosses and overturning plots. And so what I'm going to do is show you the trailers from the films, which I love, and I hope you love too. But basically, Frank is a drifter. He winds up in Glendale, as drifters do, and ends up looking for work and finds work at Nick Papadakis' restaurant. The opening scene is amazing, where Lana Turner comes out. She's in white shorts and a white blouse, and she drops her lipstick, and it rolls up to Frank, and he's just floored, right? And it's just hilarious. You got to watch it. She's just standing there being a classic femme fatale, and he's totally bamboozled. So let me see if I can give you a sense of this. It's about deception, cheating, and fraud at every turn. Each of the characters, these three characters, is in some way a con artist with an ulterior motive. Frank cons Nick, the restaurateur, into giving him a free breakfast when he wanders into the diner. Nick, in turn, cons Frank into working for him as a mechanic in his garage. Next, Frank cons Nick into accepting him as a friend, only to murder him later and so on. Every chapter in the novel has some sort of duplicitous trick. And what does that mean? And so what that gives you the sense that reality is fluid, that it's unstable, that it's constantly changing, that it's threatening, right? It's almost like a Greek play in the sense that you kind of are waiting for the bolt to come from heaven, and it's going to hit everybody eventually. Let me give you a sense of the language of James M. Cain, right? In these noir novels. Again, here we go. So, rip me, Cora cries to Frank. Feet from the corpse, they've killed Nick. And after they kill him, they want to have sex. Rip me, Cora cries to Frank. Feet from the corpse. After Frank begins to fool with her blouse to bust the buttons, I ripped her. I shoved my hand under her blouse and jerked. She was wide open from her throat to her belly. I ripped all her clothes off. She twisted and turned slow so that they would slip out from under her. Then she closed her eyes and lay back on the pillow. Her hair was falling over her shoulders in snaky curls. Her eye was all black. They'd been in a wreck. Her breasts weren't drawn up and pointing at me, but soft and spread out in two big pink splotches. She looked like the great-grandmother of every whore in the world. The devil got his money's worth that night, after they've just killed this guy. And then they're trying to figure out what to do, and I love this line. We're chained to each other, Cora. We thought we were on top of a mountain, but that wasn't it. It's on top of us. Awesome. So it's interesting that Cain's work in the movie studios did not yield much in terms of actual movie credits, but I think it taught him how to write, because almost every scene is cinematic, and it just moved naturally to film. And so here is the original trailer for The Postman Always Rings Twice. There she is.
One thing we could do that would fix everything for us.
What? Pray for something to happen to Nick?
Something like that.
Cora.
Well, you suggested it yourself once, didn't you?
I was only joking.
Were you?
Yes, I was.
Or had you started to think about it a little?
Maybe I said it, but I didn't really mean it.
Well, I say it again now, and I do mean it. Frank, listen to me. I'm not what you think I am. I've made a big mistake in my life, and I've got to be this way just once to fix it.
They hang you for a thing like that.
Oh, but not if you do it right. And you're smart, Frank. You'll think of a way. Plenty of men have.
He never did any harm to me.
But, darling, can't you see how happy you and I would be together here without him?
I've been waiting a long time for that kiss.
When we get home, Frank, then there'll be kisses. There'll be kisses with dreams in them. Kisses that come from life, not death.
I hope I can wait.
Darling. Frank, look out!
even there you can hear, you like those? I love those. Oh, so wonderful. They'll hang you for something like that. Only if you do it, what'd she say? Not if you do it right. Oh my gosh. There'll be kisses, Frank. Plenty of kisses. Oh my goodness, I love it. But you can see how this worked for Cain, even though it didn't work when he tried to write a script. I think he has 1 credit, maybe. It works when he does what he does as a novelist, and then it just transfers beautifully, almost seamlessly, to the screen. So then there was Double Indemnity, 1943. So the title, you may know it's an insurance term, where the policy pays out double if the policyholder dies in an accident. Cain said this in the early days of Hollywood, just as it was taking off, and a lot of the setting is there, and a lot of the issues of a new Hollywood boomtown are there. In this new Hollywood boomtown, the least interesting person would be an insurance agent, and yet that's the protagonist, Walter Huff, played by Fred McMurray. Right? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So again, I love this. This is, I think this is a classic Los Angeles story, and I'll tell you why at the end, but you may already think that. It's a city that's too big with too much going on, and you're just trying to do this one thing, and then you get caught up in all this other stuff. I don't know if that's been your experience in Los Angeles. He decides he's calling on a client, and he's not even going to see Mr. Nerdlinger. First of all, what a great name, right? Nerdlinger? Come on. He's going to see someone else, and he remembers Mr. Nerdlinger lives nearby, so he thought he'd go by and get him to renew his auto insurance. Oh, but Mr. Nerdlinger is not home. Who is home? His wife, Phyllis Nerdlinger. Barbara Stanwyck? Yeah. Look out. So he ends up speaking with Phyllis Nerdlinger, and he notices, that she's attractive. Let's see what the line is. Let me see. This language he uses. Oh, yes. She was small and had on a suit of blue house pajamas. She had a washed out look. Okay. And so, here we go. The plot begins. And so Phyllis starts asking him, oh, you're an insurance agent. You're my husband's insurance agent? Do you sell life insurance? Could I get a policy for my husband, and could you make sure he doesn't know? Here we go. So Walter understands that he's in deep trouble already and forges ahead, because of his base desires. And that's another theme of Cain. And so they begin to plan to kill her husband and get the $50,000 insurance payout. Now, I'm not doing this plot justice, so forgive me, but let me see if I can give you a sense of it. Walter and Phyllis carry on with the plan. They decide to make it appear that Mr. Nerdlinger had died falling out of a train, because that happens all the time, right? A moving train, and so they planned this. And then Walter plans his alibi so that he cannot be possibly implicated in this crime. And Phyllis does it, and then she drives the body to the train station where she meets Walter, who is disguised as Mr. Nerdlinger. Awesome. So Walter walks up and down the train, like, hey, I'm Mr. Nerdlinger. Can you see that I'm alive? It's okay. And then Walter jumps off at the train. They meet together, etc. As you might expect, the insurance payment does not pay out without an investigation. And the company, Walter's company, refuses to pay out initially, just as he told her they would. And so Phyllis hires a lawyer, and Walter kind of guides her through the process of how to get this claim paid off. But one day, a woman named Lola appears, who is not just a woman, it's Phyllis's stepdaughter. Dun, dun, dun. She smells a rat, right? And in fact, her mother was married to Phyllis's first husband and died of pneumonia in a winter cabin. Phyllis was her nurse. And Lola is now convinced that maybe Phyllis killed her mother. Oh my goodness. And married her father, and then now she's killed her father. It's just insane, to get his money. And so now she wants to trap Phyllis. Like I said, I'm not doing this justice, and I apologize, but by this time, Walter has fallen in love with Lola, and so decides he has to kill Phyllis. So he tries to meet Phyllis, I believe it's in Griffith Park where they meet, yeah. But Phyllis is too smart, and she ends up shooting him, or has him shot. I can't remember. Did she shoot him? Yeah. Yeah. Walter barely, I love the ending. Walter barely survives, wakes up in the hospital room with his boss, the insurance company boss, standing over him. He confesses fully. Great scene with McMurray. And he makes the deal that he will send a signed confession to this murder, or at least his part in it, from South America so that they can arrest and charge Phyllis. However, he's on this ship to South America, and who's on the ship but Phyllis? What? She tells him that Lola has married her boyfriend, and now they both realize neither of them have anything. So they jump off the ship into the shark-infested waters. This is awesome. And here is the trailer.
I killed Dietrichson. Me, Walter Neff, insurance agent, 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a while ago, that is. Yeah, I killed him. I killed him for money and for a woman. It all began last May. I was thinking about that dame upstairs and the way she had looked at me. And I wanted to see her again, close, without that silly staircase between us. How could I have known that murder can sometimes smell like honeysuckle?
I can't stand it anymore. What if they do hang me?
They're not going to hang you, baby.
It's better than going on this way.
They're not going to hang you. Because you're going to do it and I'm going to help you.
Yes, from the moment they met, it was murder. But always behind them, with his devilish hunches and his brilliant brain, was Keyes.
The murder's never perfect. Always comes apart sooner or later. And where two people are concerned, it's usually sooner.
Could they get away from him and his relentless pursuit? And could they get away with murder?
You don't know Keyes. Once he gets his teeth into something, he never lets go. He'll investigate you. He'll have you shadowed. He'll watch you every minute from now on. You afraid, baby?
Yes, I'm afraid. But not of Keyes. I'm afraid of us.
I'd like to move in on her right now, tonight. If it wasn't for Norton and his stripe pants ideas about company policy, I'd have the cops after her so quick it'd make a head spin. Now, we know the Dietrichson dame is in it, and somebody else.
Only you haven't got a single thing to go on, Keyes.
He'll show. He's got to show. Sometime, somewhere, they've got to meet.
love that scene that you saw there with Barbara Stanwyck behind the door. What a perfect metaphor for noir. So you're having this serious, important conversation with your boss, but meanwhile your lover is behind the door. That's classic. Things are hidden in these novels that inevitably emerge and wreak havoc over everything. Now, for something completely different, Mildred Pierce, right? I'm currently in the middle of the HBO series that was done a few years ago by Todd Haynes, and it's really excellent with Kate Winslet as Mildred. So, once again, a difficult plot to summarize, many twists and turns, but no real noir, no murder, well, nothing like the other two, let's say that. Set in Glendale, California in the 1930s. Cain focuses on a middle-class housewife named Mildred Pierce and her attempts to maintain her family's social position post-Depression. And it is brilliant. I honestly don't know how he did this, well, actually I do know, and I'm going to tell you how I know, but it's amazing that he made this shift. In the film, it's most famously Joan Crawford, who gives an over-the-top performance, not surprisingly. So what happens, again, bare-bones skeletal outline, is that Mildred's husband, Bert, leaves her for another woman, a German woman, let's not get into that. Mildred decides to raise her two daughters on her own, which is, again, unheard of in the 1930s. It's right after the Depression. She has no money. He does leave her the house, but that's almost a burden because now she has to keep the house up. She has two daughters. And she's trying to raise them on her own with, this is 1931 or whatever, and Bert doesn't help her. He ultimately gives her the house, but like I said, Mildred is keenly aware of social class, perhaps too much so. And so she needs a job, right? Now here's a middle-aged woman with two children who's never worked, and she needs a job. What can she do? She can bake. That's what she can do. She makes great pies. All right, so turn that into something in the post-Depression Los Angeles, or Glendale, not even Los Angeles, and raise two daughters on it. It's an impossible thing, and in this sense, Mildred is following a kind of hero's journey where she digs out of this hole and becomes successful. But that would be far too simple for James M. Cain. Because she has these two daughters, she's running around trying to get work. She eventually gets work as a waitress, and she's terrible at it, but she learns it. And in fact, she ultimately learns the restaurant business and uses her own baking skills, but also just by observing what happens in the restaurant, she ends up creating her own series of restaurants and doing okay. But there's Veda, and there's Ray. So first of all, just as she starts the business, so she's a single mother, 1930s, Glendale. She's got to work. What happens to the kids? They just stay at home. Veda's a little older. She'll take care of them, except that while she's away, this is one of her, right when she breaks out of this terrible situation, or is about to, Ray Moray is her name, gets sick, and nobody's there. She's not home. And so I think it's her neighbor ends up coming over and grabbing Ray and getting her to the hospital. Mildred's parents are very upset. Mildred's older daughter, Veda, is very upset. And of course, Ray dies. So just as she's starting to get on her own, she had to leave the child, and the child dies, devastating, of course. And I think I don't know if I should say that. I was going to say it permanently scars Veda, but I think Veda was born scarred. Veda, perhaps picking up on her mother's notion of social class and her eagerness to move up in social class. For example, Mildred has a chance to be a housekeeper and she just walks out. She won't, because she has a chance to serve in a tea room and she won't do that because she doesn't want to wait on people who are richer, or if they're not even richer, if they're higher status than she is, she doesn't want that. So she'll work in the restaurant because those are people of her own peer group. All right, so things keep going. How do I explain this? Well, first of all, she has an affair with Bert's friend Wally, and he's a great character. What a doofus. He's Bert's partner in business, and he's played brilliantly by James LaGrosse in the HBO series. He kind of facilitates her getting out of this, but he's also kind of a snake. The real problem for Mildred is her older daughter, Veda, who is more determined than Mildred to live at a higher social class and will do anything to do that. Let me see if I can give you a sense of this. Veda, eventually Mildred becomes successful at the restaurant business, and Veda enjoys this very much because now her mother's something, but then increasingly becomes more and more ungrateful. Her mother's working very hard. You know, it's not like her mother created this business and then just set it loose and raked in the money. She's still working very hard. And Veda just turns nasty, just brutal, and finds out that Veda has blackmailed a wealthy family through a fake pregnancy. Because, like I said, Veda will do anything to climb this social status. So Mildred kicks her out of the house. Veda has a beautiful voice and has been, well, I shouldn't say that. Veda's been training to become an opera singer. She does go on to great fame after some struggles. And meanwhile, Mildred has been having a kind of torrid affair with Monty, a new man she meets at the restaurant. Like her husband, Bert, Monty lost all his family's fortune in the Depression. So the Depression is almost a character in this novel. You know, it's almost just a separate character because it drives everything, that people don't have money and they're trying to figure out what the next step is, even the wealthy like Monty. So now Veda's interested because Monty's now in the picture, and he doesn't have wealth per se, but he has that aroma of wealth, that kind of aura of wealth, and that's good enough for Veda. In fact, Mildred and Monty marry, but it's not long before she finds Veda in bed with Monty. I know, right? Meanwhile, again, this is so difficult to summarize. I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense. Meanwhile, because Veda has been back in Mildred's life, Mildred wants to keep giving her things because that's how she thinks she will win her daughter's love, her eldest daughter's love. And remember, she lost her younger daughter. So she's going to hold on to her. But she doesn't have that much money. And so she begins embezzling from her own company to buy Veda's love. But meanwhile, Veda is doing pretty well as a famous opera singer, so Veda starts asking her for money, or at least contribute some of her earnings to the common good. It's just a mess. After the affair with her stepfather, after Mildred discovers the affair with Veda's stepfather, she moves to Reno, and an ultimate humiliation. Sorry, I love Reno, but, you know. Bert comes back, right, to visit her. And Mildred is forced to resign from her business empire. And then Veda comes back, but then moves to New York. She reconciles briefly with Mildred, then moves to New York. And then it ends up, what does she do? What does Veda do? She reneges on her singing contract in order to get another more lucrative one by another company. And so she leaves again. Veda leaves again. And the ending of this novel is genius because now we're back to Bert and Mildred again. And their conclusion to this journey they've been on together and apart is to, first of all, Bert says, to hell with Veda. All right. And their new agreement, Mildred and Bert's, is to get stinko. Let's just get stinko, which means to get drunk. So Mildred, Bert, Veda, Ray, what a mess. But I think I honestly don't know any novel like this. And hang on, let me see if I have this here. Oh yeah, let me give you some lines from the novel. Oh, brilliant writing here. Listen to this. Indeed, the whole scene had an ancient, almost classical ugliness to it. She's talking about Bert and Mildred. He's talking about Bert and Mildred. The whole scene, this argument, had an ancient, almost classical ugliness to it, for they uttered the same recriminations that have been uttered since the beginning of marriage, and added little of originality to them, and nothing of beauty. What? I have done that so much, been in arguments, and it's completely unoriginal. It's been done thousands of times before, and there's nothing beautiful about it. I love this line. They spoke quickly, as though they were saying things that scalded their mouths and had to be cooled with spit. See, he did listen to that vernacular language, and then he poeticized it. Yes, okay. So David Ulin, who is a great Los Angeles writer and literary critic, his book, Literary Anthology of Los Angeles, is in the bookstores, says, he has an article in the LA Review of Books called, I think it's in the LA Review of Books, called The Great Los Angeles Novel, ? Mildred Pierce, right? I mean, and I think LA Weekly a few years ago did this, what is the Los Angeles novel, right? And it ended up being Chester Himes, if he hollers, let him go, I think. But so many possibilities, right? So many. Ulin, the great literary critic of Los Angeles, says it's Mildred Pierce. Here's why, he says. He says it was his last great book. After he left Los Angeles, the books were, everyone pretty much agrees nothing much was happening in the books. Ulin says it may be the finest thing he ever wrote. Unlike its predecessors, it is expansive, and this is true, taking place over a number of years instead of over a few months, set against the backdrop of the 1930s. More to the point, it's a naturalistic portrait of a woman who turns not to murder, like we've seen before, but to her own resourcefulness. And he wrote that as a man. He wrote the woman's perspective. It is not a noir, in other words, although Cain is characteristically hard-boiled. We'll come back to that. Ulin says, for Cain, then, the drama of Mildred Pierce is by turns personal and archetypal, a mix of melodrama and tragedy built out of the detritus of suburban culture, divorce, domestic strife, the indignities and aspirations of class. Yes, the Los Angeles novel, perhaps, Mildred Pierce, set in Glendale. Oh, sorry. All right, so ready for another trailer? Here we go.
Mildred, a name gasped in the night, the one last word of a dying man, but one word that tells 1,000 stories of a woman who left her mark on every man she met.
Mildred had more to offer a man in a glance than most women give in a lifetime. Mildred knew what she wanted. It wasn't too particular how she got it. Mildred, loving her was like shaking hands with the devil.
I wonder why you brought me here tonight.
I mean, all of a sudden, boom, husband gone, soft lights, quiet room, opportunity.
You make me feel, oh, I don't know, warm.
And wanted.
How long has this been going on?
Monty's going to divorce you and marry me. And there's nothing you can do about it. You think because you've made a little money, you can get yourself a new hairdo and some expensive clothes and turn yourself into a lady. But you can't. Because you'll never be anything but a common...
Awesome. All right, so I've already mentioned that Cain is really attributed with the birth of noir in LA, or the birth of noir completely. But of course, like every good writer, he refuses that label because that's required of writers. You can't accept any label. He says this: I make no conscious effort to be tough or hard-boiled. He hated that phrase, that word, or grim, or any of the things I'm usually called. I merely try to write as the character would write, and I never forget that the average man, from the fields, the streets, the bars, the offices, and even the gutters of his country, has acquired a vividness of speech that goes beyond anything I could invent. And that if I stick to this heritage, this logos of the American countryside, brilliant, I shall attain a maximum of effectiveness with very little effort. Ulin says again, David Ulin, all books about Los Angeles have a little bit of noir in them. The city, after all, demands it, he says. Right, his book is Writing Los Angeles, a literary anthology. This is a place, Ulin writes, where many people come out for their aspiration to get famous, to get rich, to get away. Noir is what happens when they don't get what they're looking for. Noir is what happens in the aftermath, when the desperation sets in. That's one of the central stories of Los Angeles, unquote. This is actually a literary critic writing about The Cocktail Waitress, that posthumous novel. Len Gukin says, along with Dashiell Hammett, Cain was the preeminent practitioner of the American hard-boiled school. Edmund Wilson called them the poets of tabloid murder. Nice. He was writing about Cain when he wrote that. The hard-boiled genre is informed by the dialectic between poetry and the tabloid. So take the tabloid and turn it into poetry. Take poetry and make it extremely vernacular. between, he says, self-conscious linguistic intensities. Okay, self-conscious linguistic. Okay, so you're really packing in the words, right? And you're packing in a lot of emotion, self-conscious linguistic intensities, and the sensationalism of cheap newspapers. Who would have thought to put those things together? Yes. Nothing More American is an essay by Steve Erickson, LA Review of Books, I believe. He says this: in these movies that came from these novels, murder was a career move, double cross, a survival strategy, the bed, an illicit cage, proudly repellent in its nihilism, turning lack of production values into a virtue. Noir began where other movies left off, or where they would have left off if they had taken that wrong last turn. There was no love, only obsession, which lovers would choose over love anyway if they'd had a choice. I love that still there, isn't that great? Well, you may not know this, but 1933, only a couple of years after he came here, James M. Cain wrote a fairly long essay called Paradise, about us, about Los Angeles, about Southern California. It's really quite amazing. It's one of the best pieces about Los Angeles that I've ever read, and I hadn't even heard of it until I started doing this research. Paradise by James M. Cain. Let me give you a sense of it. This is the opening. See if any of this resonates with you. I shall attempt in this piece an appraisal of the civilization of Southern California. But it occurs to me that before I begin, I had better give you some idea what the place looks like. If you are like myself, before I came here, you have formed from sun-kissed ads, newsreels, movie magazines, railroad folders, and so on, a somewhat false picture of Los Angeles, and you will have to get rid of this before you can understand what I'm trying to say. He continues, wash out then the land of sunshine, fruit, and flowers. All these are here, but not with the lush, verdant fragrance that you have probably imagined. A celebrated movie comedian is credited with the remark that, quote, the flowers don't smell here, but the women do, unquote. But in my observation, nothing smells. Wash out the girl with the red cheeks, peeping coyly from behind a spray of orange leaves. The girl is here, but the dry air has taken the red out of her cheeks. The orange trees are here, but they don't look like that. The whole picture has too much pep, life, and moisture in it. I love this. Wash out the palm trees, half visible beyond the tap dancing platform. Palm trees are here, but they're all phonies, planted by people bemused with the notion of a subtropical climate, and they are so out of harmony with their surroundings that they hardly arrest your notice. You may know palm trees are not native here. They were brought in. And he continues on and on. You might think this is a takedown piece, but it's not. But let's continue. The main thing to remember is the sunlight. And for me, I love sunset here, and I love these unique colors. I just stare at it all the time. But Cain says the main thing to remember is the sunlight and the immense expanse of sky and earth that it illuminates. It sucks the color out of everything it touches, takes the green out of the leaves and the sap out of the twigs, makes human beings seem small and of no importance. I kind of actually like that. Here there is no oppressive heat, you understand. The climate is approximate as, right? Today we're saying this? Okay. Yes, exactly. And so there's this incredible deconstruction for the first 2/3 of the essay. And then he says, okay, now that you understand, now that I have taken away all your preconceptions, your assumptions about Los Angeles, when you consider the life that is encountered here, you have to admit that there's a great deal to be said for it. I'm so glad. Among these, the courtesy of the people. Okay. Well, we are well read, not well spoken apparently, but well read. They know what is going on in the world, even if they hold some strange ideas about it. I love this line. These people, Los Angelinos, are in one way or another all exiles. That is quite literally true, and I think that's psychically true and in many other ways, philosophically true. Let's see. Oh, we speak excellent English. And he would know, because remember, he grew up in a very prescriptive household about the English language. Right, we're well read. Oh, we have nutty religions. A word about the nutty religions. They don't cut anything like as much ice as you might think from reading about them. I think that's true, and I think that's a virtue of Los Angeles, but we can get back to that. They are here, these nutty religions, and practically everybody polices his discourse with pass on instead of die. He can't quite be sure what cult you may belong to. Even so, they are more like pastimes than the religions you're probably accustomed to. People find in them a relief from boredom, give them the zealous attention that a fad might command elsewhere, our religions, but they change off pretty easily from one to the other, and apparently no one cares about them very deeply. Again, I think that's a virtue. And then he concludes the essay. In short, it's going to be, this is 1933, LA is going to be a paradise on earth, and with such vaulting ambitions, it might pull off something. You can't tell. It is keenly aware of the Orient and also of Mexico. Streams are meeting here that ought to churn up some exciting whirlpools. I personally, even if the first act hasn't been so hot, am not going to walk out on the show. One thing it is going to be within the 12-month is the wine center of the world, Los Angeles. I guess you think I'm going to walk out on that, don't you? That will make a lot of things different. Paradise, 1933. All right, so what is James M. Cain's vision of Los Angeles? What is the city that he conjures in his work? Well, he's Raymond Chandler, but without the detectives. And they despised each other, absolutely despised each other. Chandler said of him, of Cain, he is every kind of writer I detest, a faux naif, a Proust in greasy overalls, a dirty little boy with a piece of chalk and a board fence and nobody looking. How interesting that Chandler would be the screenwriter for Double Indemnity, right? Hollywood. Cain is Hollywood. Even though as a scriptwriter he did not succeed there, he learned so much from Hollywood, and frankly, Hollywood learned so much from him. He says this, there's no such thing as a good one, films. And so, in return, Hollywood made 3 of his novels into films. Postman coming last, as I said. Now this, I think, is really interesting. You no doubt have gathered that his view of women was complicated, shall we say, reflective of the times, no doubt, but even for the times, complicated, I think. Femme fatale is there, but then with Mildred Pierce, you don't get that, and it's just complicated. So I love these stories about Cain and women. So Alina Cain, when she filed for divorce, said that James M. was morose, sarcastic, and insulting. About a year after that divorce, Cain married Eileen Pringle, a former silent film star. When Pringle and Cain divorced 2 years later, Pringle described Cain as moody, melancholy, and grim. I don't think it's much of a stretch to imagine this. She says that he built mental dungeons instead of castles in the air. I don't know. What would your ex say about you? I don't know. But here, before he wrote Mildred Pierce, how did he shift? Well, not surprisingly, it was a woman. This is again from David Hewlin. Cain had recently befriended a woman named Kate Cummings, who did more than anyone else to urge him toward a more sympathetic and complex view of women's need for both conventionality and freedom. Cummings, the single mother of the actress Constance Cummings, had sacrificed her own prospects as a singer, this is starting to sound familiar, to get her daughter the training and exposure she needed to become a star. What Cain saw of Kate's life, her actual life, and the nearly selfless love with which she made Constance's career happen may have jump-started his imagination for Mildred Pierce and his revision of women in his novel, as characters in his novels. Early on in Mildred Pierce, her neighbor says that Mildred tells her neighbor that Bert has left, and now here she is with these two children. And the neighbor says, "You're now part of that great American institution that never gets mentioned on the 4th of July, a grass widow with 2 small children to support." I didn't know what a grass widow was, but I looked it up, and it's apparently like a woman who's left alone because her husband is out doing various things. I think the grass part maybe came as a reference to the golf course, but whatever, it came to mean a woman left alone to fend for herself. So again, this is Hewlin. As he was writing, employing the third person and creating a female protagonist for the first time, Cummings, Kate, stood over him, prodding him to revise whenever she felt that his perceptions of a working mother did not ring true. When Mildred Pierce was finally published in 1941, Cain's alternately stilted and full-bodied portrait of a striving woman was well received, but few reviewers noted the fact that the novel was also a study of a woman who, time after time, subjugates her needs to that of her child. Hilton Als in The New Yorker writes, Mildred Pierce is the odd woman out in this gallery of moral ineptitude of Cain's work. Her aspirations are not for herself, but for her children. She doesn't want to be rich so much as she wants them to feel entitled. She's a great believer in women's rights, but she knows that as second-class citizens, women can raise themselves up only through work. Mildred's works hard so that Veda can realize her dreams. But Veda is more conventional than her mother, more of a performer, and the only audience that interests her is male. And so Veda sets out to upstage her mother with cunning and artifice. This is the city, Glendale. You remember that from Dragnet? This is the city, but it's not Glendale in Dragnet. Again, David Hewlin, which I think has the best essay. This is the great Los Angeles novel, ? Such a double vision that Cain has can be read as emblematic of Southern California, where the intimacies of daily life are at times difficult to tease out from the larger tropes. It's not that they are not there, just that we're conditioned not to see them, not to recognize this territory through such a focused lens. Like Phyllis Nerdlinger of Double Indemnity, Mildred is a character on the make, although her motivation is not dissatisfaction, but necessity. She had kids, a mortgage. It is the center of the depression, and her skills are limited. She takes a job as a waitress, goes on to open a restaurant, enduring the judgment of her daughter, Veda, who seeks a path to a higher social plateau. This is where Cain's genius for the particular emerges, allowing him to trace the subtle tension between a suburb such as Glendale, where Mildred lives in a modest house, and neighboring Pasadena, which is as close as Southern California comes to old money. Similar oppositions persist to this day, or as Steve Martin calls it, Pasadena. Michael Tolkien in The Nation writes, Mildred Pierce is a message sent from Glendale. I'm sorry, Glendale's fine. And Glendale stands for nothing more than any suburban town anywhere in the country. I think this is right. And he gives it no symbolic meaning. If anything, he admires the town that offers struggling people like Mildred and her crew in the restaurants a chance to work for themselves. I think that's right. Glendale is every town, every suburb. And then finally, the road as a theme in Cain's work that is uniquely Los Angeles. This is from David M. Fine in American Studies. The entire novel, Double Indemnity, is a grand auto tour of Southern California. A fact not lost on Billy Wilder, who did the film version in 1943. With the Chandler screenplay, of course. Few novels have given us so rich a sense of the varied landscapes of Southern California, the distinct textures of its different neighborhoods. In The Postman Always Rings Twice, the road leads nowhere, doubles back on itself, appears to be leading to freedom, but is actually circular, carrying Frank away from his future back into his past. Caught up in the illusory freedom of the California highway, he tells Cora, I'm talking about the road. It's fun, Cora. I know every twist and turn it's got, and I know how to work it too. Isn't that what we want? Just a pair of tramps like we really are? But Cora knows the road too and knows that it leads nowhere. She wants outdoor tables, striped awnings, and lanterns to attract highway traffic. Cora dreams the dream of commercial success, Frank of nobility and the open road. Both are versions of the American and the Californian dream, embodied in polar images of home and highway, the two-car garage and the fast car in the fast lane. And there's a wonderful scene in Mildred Pierce where behind the wheel of her car, the line is, she gave the car the gun, exactly watching the needle swing past 30, 40, 50. The car was pumping something into her veins, something of pride, of arrogance, of restrained self-respect that no talk, no liquor, no love could possibly give. Thank you for your attention. That's James N. Cain.